All right, so these two videos are actually the ones that I've been waiting and dying to do for the entirety of this chapter. And if you have not seen the full potential of what Substance Designer is going to allow you to do in your work, these are going to be the videos that will open your eyes. Because what we can do is, without having to do too much extra work, go ahead and package an entirely different looking fabric or material within this material here. And with just a click of a button, we can get two totally different looks relatively easily. And so we're going to be developing this kind of squared off leather pattern with a little bit of stitching in between. And we can do that all in the graph itself. We don't have to go ahead and create another material. So how do we start that, right? Well, like any material we've been doing, let's go ahead and start by creating the pattern or our height map. And I'm going to bring our initial height map back over here, because what we're going to be doing is creating our new height map over here and then just blending it in over top of our other height map. So like we've seen before, let's go ahead and create a shape node, and we'll bring this up and over here. And because this new pattern is already kind of like a diamond shape, we aren't going to have to do too much with this shape node, but we are going to have to rotate it, obviously. So taking a look, let's go ahead and just bring our scale down to around 0.97 so that we're going to get this little kind of border off the edges of the square here. And now I'm going to go ahead and just use the rotation 45 degree. Again, we could just go and rotate it here like this, but it's not going to give us exactly the desired result. You can see that we're getting this kind of offset black diamond pattern as these white patterns kind of overlay on top of each other. So not quite exactly what we want, but instead we actually want to rotate kind of this entire pattern generation. So fortunately, this node provides us with this rotation 45 degree. So if I select that to be true, now you can see we're going to get this tiling perfectly. And it's going to also tile it in those spaces there. So now we're getting this diamond shape. Now again, this pattern is going to be a little bit too contrasted. So let's go and give it some gradation around the edges. I'm going to use a bevel node in this particular instance because I find that it works very well for this very binary detail. And let's go and bring the distance again into the negative, right? So that it's going to kind of eat inwards from the initial pattern. So I think I'm going to do around negative 0.08, I think was a good kind of value in my testing here. And I'm also going to just bring the smoothing all the way up, actually to about a value of 10. Remember, soft caps on these sliders, so I can actually input a value of 10, and it's going to soften it out even more. So now we've got something kind of working. Let's just add this to our height so that we can get kind of a visual in 3D. So let's go and add a blend node, and I'll make sure to plug in our new pattern with the height socket there into the top. And now the blending mode that I want to use is going to be multiply, because right now we're just going to be getting this pure white value, right, that we've created without any of this kind of leather pattern underneath it, right? We're going to get a little bit of the leather that we created for the normal map exclusively in the previous video, but I want to be able to harness everything else we've created as well. So let's just go and set this to be multiply. And now you can see we've got pretty much a totally different pattern, but we're not quite done yet because this diamond is relatively large compared to our other surface detail. So we kind of want these to match up just a little bit. So coming back up to our secondary height here on this bevel node, I want to go ahead and just add a blur high quality grayscale again, just to kind of solidify that it's a little bit softer. And we're only going to need a quality of 1 and about an intensity of 1 as well, something just very, very subtle. And finally, like I was mentioning, we're going to want to tile this a little bit so that the heights kind of match up size-wise. So let's go and use a tile generator node. Again, I'm going to use a generator in this particular instance only because it's really not an overly complicated design I want to do. I just want to tile this a couple times. So a tile sampler node might be a little bit of overkill with the options it provides. So with this tile generator, let's make sure that we're going to accept our input image here under pattern. And we're going to be able to get this kind of dense pattern. And something you might notice, again, which we've kind of been accounting for previously, even though it's not really shown up, is when you're using tiling nodes, we're going to be getting this kind of sharp grid-like information in our image. And if we take a look in our 2D as well, you can see it showing up. And what this is just the image filtering. So when we're plugging in our image into this node, it's then taking that image and stamping it, on a grid pretty much from left to right, top to bottom. And that's why we've been going ahead and changing this from bilinear plus bitmaps to just bilinear. And that's going to fix that up and just make it the highest resolution possible. So hopefully now it kind of makes sense as to why I've been telling you to do that, even though it wasn't really apparent in the previous materials. And now while this is looking pretty cool, our detail is now incredibly small, and we've kind of gone the opposite direction where now our secondary height is actually too small compared to the scale of our leather here. So let's come back to our X and our Y, and I'm just going to change this to be a value of 2 by 2. And now we're going to very easily get a pretty cool looking pattern. So now while we have the diamond pattern all set up, we don't have that stitching in between each one of these kind of cushions here, right? So we're going to have to go and set that up. And here's an area where I do kind of want to draw your attention because it's kind of a very critical aspect of working with materials and trying to make the work kind of work for you so that you're not ultimately doing more work than you actually have to. So what do I mean by that, right? That's a lot that's just kind of come at you, maybe a little bit out of nowhere. So what I mean by that is we kind of have two options here where we can go and apply or add our stitching. The first option, which probably is kind of the most intuitive, or at least would be the first kind of readily apparent thought, would be to go and create this stitching pattern all along here and add it to our tiled pattern. However, that means we're going to have to do a lot of different lines and a lot of different transitions, and we're going to have to line things up. And then say we want to go ahead and just change the number of patterns that we're doing, right? Well, then all of a sudden we're going to have to update all of that stitching we've done, and it's just not going to be very flexible. So instead, where we want to do this is going to be before we've gone ahead and tiled it. So we're actually going to want to apply our stitching kind of in this area here where we've just created our single pattern, and then it's going to do all the tiling for us. So no matter what we set this tile to be, it's going to update the stitches pretty much automatically for us. So now that we know where we're going to set this up, let's take a look at actually how we're going to do that. So again, let's go ahead and create another shape node. And this time I'm going to use a paraboloid. And I'm going to bring the scale down to about 0.9, just to kind of bring it off the edges there. And you're thinking, okay, this doesn't really look like a stitch, right? It's kind of circular. So what we can do is bring the X size way down to something like 0.15, and ta-da, we're going to get something that kind of looks like a stitch. Revolutionary, I know. And now the fortunate thing about the shape node is that it's also going to allow me to tile this so that I don't have to go ahead and create a tile generator node. So I'm going to bring this up to something like 7, and that's going to give us 7 vertically. However, it's also going to give us 7 horizontally. And we don't want horizontal, we just kind of want this center strip vertically. So now, like we had seen with the knit material where we had a little bit of overhang in our pattern and we didn't want that tiling to occur, we can do the same thing here. So I'm going to scroll up with my shape node, and under the tiling mode, under our base parameters, let's go and set this to absolute because I absolutely want to make sure we are only tiling vertically, so that now we're going to get 7 tiling vertically. Now, something to be aware of is that if I go ahead and tile this down to 6 or an even number, you'll see it's going to kind of offset a little bit. That's just unfortunately how these nodes kind of work with the generation of the shapes behind the scenes. So if you want it to be tiling vertically down the center of this image, make sure that you set it to an odd number. So we'll go back to 7. Cool. So let's go ahead. Create a blend node first because it's always good to see our things visually as they're blending together while we work on them. And let's go ahead and just change the blending mode to be max. So it's going to take the brightest values of this top image, and it's going to basically just overlay them on top of the darker areas. So you can see that because this stitch is brighter than the values underneath it, it's going to show up. However, as we work towards the center, because the values pretty much are the same, we're not going to really notice the difference. And so max is going to be the blending mode we're probably going to want to stick with here, since we're going to be shoving them in these very dark kind of cavity areas. So the first thing we're going to have to do is go ahead and use a transformation 2D node so that we can actually position this in the correct spot. So let's go and first rotate this 45 degrees. So you can go ahead and type 45 in here and hit apply, or holding down shift and then clicking outside of your image, we can go and rotate at 45-degree increments. And now I'm going to go and add another transformation 2D. Just like I've mentioned before, I don't like to kind of blend together transformations within one node because it can make things a little bit difficult later on when you want to change it. So now with this node here, this is going to be our translation, and we're going to move this off to the side. So I'm going to visualize this node here and then single click back on our transformation 2D because I want to go positive on the X, and it's going to work kind of inversely where positive is going to go towards the left here. But I'm going to go to a value of 0.5. And now we'll see if we take a look, we're going to get the stitching tiling this direction. So that's a start, but we'll notice that we have 3 other pockets where it's not going to be tiling. So what we could do is go ahead and just draw off other transformation 2D nodes from here and then go ahead and rotate everything accordingly. But again, thinking about it, that's way more work than is necessary, and if we change something, we're going to have to go and change all those nodes, and it's just going to be a big mess, and there's probably going to be some tears shed along the way. However, we have used a node in particular that is going to really benefit us, and it's okay if it's not readily apparent to you, but that node is going to be a mirror grayscale node, right? Because if we think about it, all we want to do is take this information with the stitches, mirror that over, and then we're going to want to take that and mirror that under. So let's bring our transformation back here and add a mirror grayscale node, right? So that we're going to get this kind of V, which is going to be perfect for this pattern here. And then we can go and take that and mirror that back under, like I just said. So with this second mirror grayscale node, we're going to want to make sure that we set our axis to be Y so that it's going to mirror vertically, and it's going to take the information from the top. So that's why I've pretty much gone ahead and started in the left side so that we mirror to the right, and then we go from top to bottom there. And we can see very quickly we've gone ahead and created our stitching, which is going to line up perfectly for our single pattern, so that when we go ahead and tile this and say I want to tile this maybe 5 by 5, we can see no matter what I tile this to, it's going to line up perfectly. And so really fundamentally, that's going to be our new pattern. Again, it's pretty much the same number of nodes as our initial pattern was, and we can also harness the height map that we've created for the leather pattern to then use our padding pattern on top of and really bolster that look. Now, the final thing I want to do is go ahead and just provide these stitches their own color, just in case we want to go and expose that later, which, hint, hint, we're going to do that in the next video. So now, unfortunately, the way we've set this up, I'm not really going to be able to use this node here to kind of capture some of that stitching pattern, because we're also going to have this cushiony pattern in the mix as well. And there really isn't a great way to kind of just capture and isolate the stitches themselves. So the way I'll do this is I'm going to just duplicate this tile generator once I have it set up how I like it. We can bring this up over top, and let's just plug in our stitching pattern. And so basically what we've done is use the same properties in the same setup, but this time we've only fed it the stitches themselves. So that now I can go ahead and use this for our mask, for our color. So let's go ahead and just quickly run this through a histogram scan node, so that I can really crank up the contrast there and bring up the position to capture just pretty much a black and white mask. Maybe bring this back just a little bit to around 0.95. And actually, maybe I'll bring the position to around 0.95 as well. And pretty easily, we've gone ahead and created this mask. So let's add this to our color here. So I'm going to just bring back all of our color information here. And I'm going to add a blend node between our HSL node and our sharpen because I don't want this HSL to contribute to the stitching color. I want that to be something entirely separate. So we'll add the blend node there and capture this mask so that now we can go and duplicate this color node, plug this in over top, and let's just make sure that our mask is capturing enough data, and that's looking pretty good. I might actually go ahead and just dial the contrast back just a little bit, try and smooth everything out. And maybe let's bring the position back up to around 0.98. There we go, so that's looking pretty cool. So by default, I do want our stitch to be the same color as our leather here. But in the next video, we'll take a look at exposing this as a parameter. So again, we can go ahead and really give it whatever color we want. So now that we have our secondary pattern set up, we're going to want to set up a couple parameters that we can use to switch between this pattern and just our initial base leather pattern. So the first area I want to start is again going to be towards the beginning or the left side of our graph where we've gone and defined our heights. So we'll take a look and see that really right now, what's driving pretty much this entire graph is this node right here, where we've gone and combined these heights together. So how are we going to be able to swap between them? Now there's a couple ways we could do it, but we're going to be taking a look at the easiest way and the most straightforward way because the other ways involve a little bit of functions, and that's a little bit beyond the scope of this course. So I'm going to come into our blend node here. And pretty much what we're going to want in terms of user experience or UX is the ability to just go over and click a button, which is going to completely swap the material from being this padding material to just a basic leather pattern. And so how are we going to be able to translate a slider into a button? Well, I can go ahead and start to type in switch. And you can see we're going to have a couple different switch options. And again, working in grayscale, let's keep it in grayscale. So in terms of like programming, computer science, the idea of switch is pretty ingrained within, well, computer science itself, right? Basically setting something as true or false, on or off, 0 or 1. So the idea here is that even looking at the sockets, we have input 1 as true, and we've got input 2 as false. And if we look in our parameters, our only parameter is true or false. So basically, we can input two different types of data, and depending on what the switch is set to, we control the flow of the data. So thinking about how this is going to be set up, by default or set to false, I'm going to want to just use the basic leather pattern. So let's go and plug in our leather pattern here into the bottom socket, which is going to be false. And now I'm going to want to actually take the output of these two combined and plug that into our top input for input 1, right? Because we either want to have these two blended together or we want to have the basic leather. We're never going to want to have just this pattern of itself because we're using that as kind of like an accent to what we already had. So we can bring that up. And now let's go and shift click to steal this, and we can set that back up. So now we can see that by clicking this to true, we're going to get our secondary pattern, and by clicking it to false, we are now going to get just our basic pattern. So mind's blown, right? You can probably pause the video, take a second, maybe get a drink of water, and just kind of regroup or recollect yourself. All right, jokes aside though, we are not out of the water yet. And while we might not see why that is, if we go back up to our color, and I go and change our stitching color to be something like red, you can see that that's going to be a bit of an issue because now we are just getting color for really no reason whatsoever. And it's great when we have this switched on, but when we turn it off, we're not going to want that to show up. So just like we had done down here where we've pretty much gated off the control via a switch, we're going to want to switch this color as well. So let's go and add a switch color node. And again, thinking what's going on, we're going to want to have this color set up when we have this enabled to being true, right? Like we did with our height. So I'll plug that into our top node here. And when we set this to false and we're using just a basic leather pattern, we're going to want the initial leather color. So we can set this HSL node into the bottom. And now let's plug our switch into sharpen. So now I can switch this on or off. However, you'll notice that, well, I'm going to have to do this independently, right? So when I turn off the height, then I'm going to have to turn off the color, and that's kind of awkward. So how do we go about making this just one button that we have to press, and it's going to do all the work for us? Well, we're going to do this when we go and expose these as parameters. So I'm going to come down into the parameters for our color switch, and let's go ahead and expose this. Now, I'm going to want to name this something a little bit more specific. So we can call this pattern switch and hit OK. And let's confirm that. So like we've seen again, we're not going to have the ability to go ahead and access this. And if we take a look in our graph parameters here, as I scroll down and take a look at our switch here, again, we'll see when I set this to false, it's going to control the color, but it's not controlling our pattern or our height. So what we can do is actually come back down to this switch grayscale node. And if I select this and I come down to expose it like I would normally, you'll see that we actually have another option here called pattern switch, right? Which is exactly the parameter that we've just exposed. When you expose parameters within your graph of a certain type, like we had seen with floats, integers, booleans, in this case, this is a boolean, what we're actually doing is exposing this value to be used in pretty much any node that will accept that specific type. And because this is a switch node that uses a true or false boolean type, we can actually access that value. So now when I set that to be our parameter controller, and I double click back in my graph again, because we want to go to this switch node or switch parameter. When I go and set this to true, now you can see that it's done both the color and the height map, and that's going to be really powerful. So let's just quickly go ahead and call this pattern switch as well. And finally, what I want to do is actually bring this to be the top value, because as we can see right now, when I'm previewing this, pattern switch is going to be at the bottom. And if I want to, have all these open, but then go and switch my pattern, it's going to be at the bottom, but I want to put it up at the top. So in order to do that, you can see kind of on the left side of each one of these is these little kind of ridges or these carrots. And when you bring your mouse over it, it's going to look like you can move this. And that's actually indeed what you can do. So I'm going to just click and drag this all the way up to the top and let go. And now when I go in preview, you can see my pattern switch is going to be at the top of my input parameters. So now that we've exposed those switches, which is really the biggest parameter for this material, let's go ahead and just expose the color for our stitches themselves. So again, nothing new here. Let's go ahead and expose this. And I'll want to call this stitch color. And now we can take a look again in our input parameters here, making sure that we also identify this as something a little bit more readable. So again, stitch color. And I also want to go and actually insert this into our color group so that it's going to be one and the same. So now taking a look, just making sure that it's in the same group. That's really looking cool. And finally, the last thing I want to do for this particular material is just go ahead and make sure that our stitches are getting appropriate roughness applied to them. Because right now, what's actually going on, if we take a look, is that we're going to be drawing from this edgeware mask that we had created, but we're not actually getting any unique roughness for the stitches themselves. Now, this may or may not be important to you, but I just want to show it for sake of completion. So because we already have created pretty good masks for our stitches, we really aren't going to have to go to too much more trouble. So I'm going to bring this over and give ourselves some more room, and let's go and add a blend node. So I want to come back up to where we have pretty much just pure unadulterated binary mask for our stitches here, which again is our histogram scan. And let's go and plug this into our node, because what we can do is use this to apply roughness over top. And now again, the blending mode I want to use is going to be screen, because I want to get rid of the black areas in the mask and only keep the white areas. And we can set this to around maybe 0.75, just so it's not pure white. And now we're going to get a very defined contrast in terms of the roughness for the stitches versus the leather. However, again, if we just take one more look here, if I go ahead and say I want to switch this to be just the leather, well, we've got yet another issue. But we've already seen how we can fix that, and it's going to involve a switch. So let's go and bring this up, and I'm going to hit switch grayscale. Again, the node where we are actually adding roughness for our stitches will go in the top for true. Our basic roughness, which in this case is, kind of difficult to see, but it's going to be this last node here, is going to be false in our bottom. And for the switch grayscale, I'm going to make sure that I set the parameter to be controlled by our pattern switch yet again. So now if I go ahead and go and set this pattern switch, we are not going to get that roughness showing up. So really, by and large, that is a pretty flexible and pretty robust material that we've gone ahead and created. Now, I do want to show you kind of one little caveat about our design, and probably something that you will run into at some point. And while it's not super critical to the functionality, it certainly is pretty vital to the user experience when you're bringing this into other applications. And so what am I talking about? Well, I'll double click in our graph again and come down to our parameters, and you'll see that I've got my pattern switch, I've got my crease intensity, I've got my roughness, which if we take a look is going to give us this grunge intensity, and I've got my color. But you'll see that I can actually still go and adjust the color for the stitch, even though it's not visible on our material. Now, when I go ahead and set this to true, right, it's gone ahead and switched the color for us, but I don't want to actually show that parameter unless I have direct access to seeing it on my material. And this is going to happen very frequently with materials that you create, where you want to essentially hide GUI or graphical user interface items from the user unless they have access to it. So we can actually do that in Substance Designer here. However, unfortunately, the way we do that is a little programmer-y, but it is pretty straightforward and pretty spoken English to a certain degree. But I'll walk you through how we can do that right now. So I'll come back to my parameters, and I'll come down to where we have this color, stitch color. And you'll notice down at the bottom that we actually have this little text area that I can go ahead and write things in, and it says visible if. This is the area which is going to allow you to hide GUI items based on an expression. And now, if you have never done any programming, don't worry. Expression is basically just a statement. So this parameter is going to be visible if whatever I type in this box is true. Well, what's going to be true for this to be visible, right? Well, our pattern switch, our Boolean here, this button that goes between setting our pattern to be the padding or just the basic leather, is going to be true. So all I want to say, if I go ahead and just copy this identifier, now again, this is a very critical point. We need to identify things through their identifier, because this is kind of the back end of Substance Designer. I'll just Control-C that. And so we'll see that there's a bit of a way to type this out if we take a look here. And I will link you to the actual official documentation so that you can read that as well, so that you're not just having to guess this every time. But the idea is that we have to explicitly type input, square bracket, parentheses, and then what our actual identifier is, with a closed parentheses and a closed bracket. So let's just do it and we can see what it actually looks like. So I'm going to type input, square bracket, parenthesis. I'm now going to hit Control-V to paste the identifier from the value that I'm basically saying, is this true or is this not true? Is this false? Parenthesis again, and close bracket. So I know that this can look both very simple and also somewhat cryptic to a certain degree. But just to kind of reiterate as a final note, what we're saying is this identifier, the GUI for this particular parameter, is only going to be visible if the input pattern switch, which is this parameter and identifier up here, is true. Otherwise, this is no longer going to be visible. So let's go and hit preview here and take a look at color. So because pattern stitch is set to true, this is going to be visible. But when I go and set this to false, we no longer have access or visibility on that particular parameter. And so like I've said, not super critical to the functionality per se, but it definitely looks a lot better and responds a lot better for the user experience. So now that we're done with our materials, it's time for us to take a look at bringing these into the real world, or at least bringing them into a format that other software is going to be able to read. And so there's two ways that we can go about doing this. The first way is making these bitmap images, which I'm sure you might be familiar with working with to a certain degree. However, the second way is a more proprietary way that Substance has, which allows you to better integrate these graphs we've created into your workflow for other applications. And so it's important to note that only one of these two ways is actually going to allow you to use and play around with those exposed parameters that we've created in other applications. So let's take a look at just exporting these as simple bitmap images, which you can use really anywhere that accepts images. Now there's a couple ways we could do this. If we take a look in our 2D view here, right, and I go ahead and say I double click on one of these images, it doesn't really matter which node I use. You'll notice that we have a couple of options right up at the top here. And the option that we can use to save these is going to be this little floppy disk icon. And we can see that it will save current image as a bitmap. So I can actually just select really any one of these nodes and save, this individual image as a bitmap if I don't want to necessarily use these outputs for whatever reason, or I need this particular node for a specific thing I need to do. So while that's great to save out one or two images here or there, when we're going ahead and crafting entire materials, it's not going to be ideal to have to double click on each one, go ahead and save it, double click on the next one, go ahead and save it. And so there's an easier way to go ahead and batch export these. If I come over to our graphs here, and I'll just right click on our NIC graph and go down to export outputs as bitmaps, we're going to get this dialog box pop up, and it's going to allow us to save all of our outputs. And so that's kind of why it's important to make sure that you have an output node for particular channels for your material, is that this is going to allow us to very quickly export those textures. And then we can go ahead and mix and match, say we don't need height or AO, maybe we don't need the metallic either, and we only need these top three, we can go ahead and export just those. This top bar here is going to allow you to determine where you want to actually export these. We can change the format from a wide variety of different image file types, although I'd recommend working in PNG or PNG files. And finally, this pattern is essentially going to be how we batch name these files once they get written to our hard drive. So we can see it's going to use our graph name, which is NIT, and the identifier for each one of these outputs. And we can see, right, I had the height selected initially. And so upon export, this would be NIT_height. Once you're satisfied with that, go ahead and you can hit export outputs. Now, working with bitmaps is really convenient, but it's not super flexible in case we go ahead and make changes a little bit later when we want to maybe change the look or the color or play around with the exposed parameters that we had made in the previous videos. So that's where the idea of Substance archive files is going to come into play. Now, this is a proprietary format, so it's not something that you could just go and save other types of data that you have as this particular format. This is more specific to the export process here in Substance Designer. So how do we do that, right? Well, I first kind of want to explain what a Substance archive file is versus just a regular SBS file. So an SBS file is really just these three different graphs that we went ahead and made. So this graph right here that is controlling the process of creating this knit material is an SBS file. It's going to open up in other designer applications. If I shared this file with a friend, they can go ahead and manipulate these nodes if they want to and go ahead and change all this. And they'll be able to save that format as their own unique SBS file. An sbsar file, or substance archive file, on the other hand, is pretty much a one-way path. So I can bundle up this graph here, exposing just a couple different parameters, which will allow you to change the material in a more structured and controllable way, and give that to somebody else. However, they won't be able to open it quite like a graph. And so in another Substance Designer file, what it would look like is really just another node which you either plug things in or get information out from. As well, in other applications, some applications have a substance integration, which will allow you to bring those sbsar files in, which are really just a compressed version of your graphs, and allow you to play around and tweak some of those parameters. So we'll take a look at what that looks like in another application a little bit later in this series, but let's take a look at actually packaging this up together. And so notice how I'm referring to it as a package, right? Our sbsar files. Well, remember that we've housed all of these different graphs in this materials.sbs package. And you'll see if I go ahead and click on this package, we actually have these little buttons pop up as well. Whereas if I just click on a graph, these aren't going to show up. So the way that you create these substance archive files is by these packages. So right now, if I went ahead and exported this particular package, every time I brought in this materials package into another application, it would also be bringing in this knit, denim, and faux leather materials. So I kind of want to section these off into their own individual packages so that I know when I'm bringing one in, I know the contents of what I'm bringing in with it. So I'm going to just right click in our Explorer and hit new package, and I'll do this 2 more times. So now very simply, I can go ahead and just click and drag this package, or this graph, sorry, into another package. And I'll do that for the denim and the leather as well. So now we're not going to have anything in our material SBS, and that was just kind of used for the time being to keep everything together. So now let's go ahead and just quickly save these packages here. So I'll just go and save this knit package. And now that I've saved all of these packages as the working package files, the SBS files, I can go ahead and start to export these as substance archive files. So I'll select our knit package first, and I'll go up and just publish the selected element. And so now we'll notice that this is going to save, again, like I've said probably 100 times by this point, as an sbsar file. And this is going to be a substance archive, which is going to be the way that we can bridge kind of this gap or this workflow into other applications. And now if you're using an older version like me, you'll notice that the icons are a little bit different than the orange Substance Designer icons because they're actually displaying this green Substance Player icon. And so that's something to look out for if you're using an older version. Unfortunately, I'm recording this around the time when Adobe announced their kind of rebrand and relaunch of the Substance Suite, so they're getting a whole variety of different icons. So this might look a little bit different than what you have now, but do not worry, just make sure that it is an sbsar. And finally, once we go ahead and export that selected element, we'll also get a secondary dialog window. You can feel free to go ahead and just hit OK by default because all of the default options are going to be pretty much everything that you're going to need. So now go ahead and save out the other 2 as sbsar files, and then we'll take a look at what opening one of these files looks like in Substance Designer. So I've gone ahead now and just created a new empty graph in our materials working package. And I want to go and open 1 or 2 of these sbsar files and just to see what it looks like. So we'll go up to File and Open, and let's go ahead and just open all 3 of these. So they'll come in kind of very similar to our SBS packages up here, but we'll notice that they're going to have this .sbsar on the end of them, and they might have these little locks on kind of beside the icons there. So what that's going to mean is that they really are non-editable. So we're not going to be able to necessarily save them or work with them quite like we did with our graphs. So let's take a look at our leather here. So I'll drag and drop this in, and you can see that it's just going to be a node, right? It's not a whole entire graph. Well, at least visually, it is technically behind this little GUI element here, but it's going to be perceived and operate much like a node would for really anything we're going to be doing with it. And we'll notice that it doesn't have any inputs because we didn't offer any inputs in that graph, but we're going to have all of our material channel outputs based off of the output nodes that we provided it. And so if I just right click and drag and drop this into my 3D, we can see that I'm going to get that leather material showing up. And if I click on this node, we're also going to have all those parameters that we had exposed in that initial graph. So I can go ahead and get this, kind of cool padded leather pattern. I can go and change the hue. I'll probably change the saturation as well. There we go, of this leather here. And I can even go ahead and change the stitch color and really anything else that we've provided it. So this is also a great way if you want to be able to give team members or clients specific functionality where they're not going to be able to break the node necessarily, but still have the ability to work within a somewhat constrained tool set. As well, you can go ahead and incorporate this into your library so that you can start building a library of nodes for specific textiles so that you can start dragging and dropping them into future projects so that you're not going to have to remake leather or remake denim when perhaps a new kind of material demands that information.